Philosophy of Mind, Lecture 10, Theories of Meaning.
In the last lecture, we examined Jerry Fodor's language of thought theory, which claimed that intentional states, thought in general, has a linguistic structure, meaning thereby that our beliefs, desires, fears, hopes, and so on have the structure of sentences. And so, just like sentences are composed of smaller, meaningful components which can be combined in various ways according to rules, the same is true of thought. Although that theory faced a number of objections, for our purposes now, we're going to assume that something like it is correct. In particular, we'll grant that intentional states are composed of smaller meaningful parts analogous to the words in a sentence, which we shall call concepts. And we're now going to get to the heart of the matter. We're going to ask that key question: how do these elements, these words of mentalese, to use Fodor's terminology, come to be meaningful, to be about things? How, in other words, is intentionality, that key feature of the mental, possible? Or to put that slightly differently, perhaps, by virtue of what does an entity in your mind or in your brain come to have a meaning or be about anything at all? Ordinary physical things, as we've seen a couple of times, don't seem to be about anything at all. This lectern just sits here being itself. But somehow these mysterious things in our minds or brains, these concepts, these mental words, are words with meanings about things. And what we seek is an explanation for how anything can come to be about or represent another thing, an explanation, again, of how intentionality is possible. Theory 1, the resemblance theory. We'll begin with a very traditional theory. Although it may be traced back to ancient times, it was especially prominent in the early modern period of philosophy, which is usually the 17th, 18th centuries. A very common claim in that period was that our ordinary perceptions of things in the world around us actually were quite different in nature than common sense might have us believe. Ordinary, normal people take themselves, when looking at a tree, to be seeing the tree. That is, the physical tree itself is the object of their perception, the thing they are seeing or aware of. But most early modern philosophers actually claimed that this was not the case. Rather, what we perceive are not the physical objects themselves, but our own ideas of them, our own mental images, as it were, or mental representations of the physical objects. You probably think that's a strange thing to believe, but actually it was supported by many strong arguments, some of which we've seen hints of, especially back in Lecture 1. Perhaps most compelling amongst these was the dream argument. Think about what goes on during a dream. You have some kind of perceptual experience which you take to be of the physical world around you. You have a lovely dream where you're relaxing on a warm beach in the Caribbean, sipping a pina colada next to the person of your dreams, literally speaking. But then, of course, and unfortunately, you wake up and discover that in reality you're not on the beach. You're in your bed at home in the middle of winter and desperately alone. Now, once you've got over your depression, think about what all that means. Ask yourself just what it is you're perceiving during the dream. Are you actually perceiving a real physical beach? Actually tasting a real physical pina colada? Actually touching the person of your dreams? Well, of course not. It's a dream. There is no beach, no pina colada, no person of your dreams. So what are you perceiving? What are you aware of? What is the object of your perception? It must be something else, a mental image, as it were, of a beach, a pina colada, a person. So in dreams, then, what we see are mental images. But of course now, our ordinary waking perception is qualitatively indistinguishable from dream perception. That's why so often we're incapable of determining in a dream whether we are dreaming. The dream perception seems to be just like our actual waking perceptions. Well, that lets us reach the conclusion now. If in dreams what we see are mental images, and ordinary waking perception is indistinguishable from dreams, the conclusion seems to follow. Even during ordinary waking perception, what we see, what we're aware of, are mental images. But what is a mental image exactly? It's some sort of entity that exists not in the physical world, but in the mind. It's something that makes it the case that our dreams are about things. When we have certain mental images, we're dreaming about beaches. When we have other mental images, we're dreaming about pina coladas and so on. But again, not just our dreams. The idea is that even during ordinary perception, what we're aware of are mental images too. So when you look at that tree outside the window, what you're aware of directly is not the physical tree itself, but rather a mental image of that tree, and that mental image makes it the case that your perception is of a tree. But that now leads us back to our starting question. By virtue of what does a mental image, this thing in the mind, come to be about or to represent the thing that it represents? And that brings us to our first theory, one which is most applicable when the mental words we're talking about are conceived as kinds of images as they are here. Our first theory is called the resemblance theory, and stated roughly it's this. Mental objects can be about or represent things in the world by virtue of resembling them, much as an image represents the thing it's an image of. Problems for the resemblance theory. The resemblance theory is definitely intuitive. There's no doubt that resemblance is often the basis for one thing representing or being about another in our ordinary life. For example, we standardly take a realistic painting or a photograph of a tree to represent that tree, precisely because they resemble the tree. And the theory seems to work especially well for cases of mental imagery and dreams, when our mental life does seem to be rather imagistic in character. Nevertheless, there are a number of problems with the theory as a general account of intentionality, of how our thoughts come to be about things, and we'll take a look at several. First, for physicalists who believe that all that ultimately exists is physical in nature, this theory won't get off the ground. For a physicalist, mental representation occurs in the brain, but brains, or brain states and processes, don't resemble anything other than other brains or brain states and processes. If representation, the ability for one thing to be about another, involved the first thing resembling the second, then no brain state could ever represent anything other than some brain state. Brains would only be able to think about brains, in other words, which is clearly not the case. It follows for a physicalist, then, that resemblance cannot be necessary for one thing to represent another thing. A second problem for the resemblance theory. Even if we give up on a physicalist theory, even the non-physicalist who's willing to admit the existence of non-physical things like minds has her share of problems with the resemblance theory. For let's think a little bit more deeply about what it means for one thing to resemble another thing. Two things resemble each other, it seems, if they share properties. If object X is red and so is object Y, then they resemble each other, at least with respect to color. The more properties they share, the more they resemble each other. But then, if so, it's not fully clear just how images of almost any sort would even count as literally resembling the thing they're allegedly images of. Contrast a photographic image of a cat, for example, with an actual cat. The real cat has the following properties. It's furry, it's mammal, it's alive, it's 2 feet long, it breathes. While the photograph is 4 by 6 inches, flat, composed of paper and chemicals, and so on. These two objects, in fact, have almost no properties in common, and thus don't really count as resembling each other. And the problem is even more extreme with respect to a mental image of a cat. A mental image would have even less in common with the real cat. It would be mental, not exist in space, depend for its existence on being perceived, and so on, all unlike the real cat. The problem then is this. Resemblance theorists want to claim that mental images represent the world by virtue of resembling those things. But given this conception of resemblance, that two things resemble insofar as they share properties, it's just not clear that mental images could or do genuinely resemble anything physical. If they do somehow succeed in representing physical objects, it must not be by virtue of resembling them. A third problem for the resemblance theory. So far we've objected that neither brain states nor mental images could resemble the things they're supposed to be about. We'll next note that we can think about some things that nothing could possibly resemble, simply because they're not the sorts of things that the notion of resemblance even meaningfully applies to. For consider abstract thoughts. An abstract thought is one about something which doesn't have any spatial or temporal properties. For example, many people agree that truth is a virtue, and that democracy is the least awful of all the possible forms of government. But while concepts like truth and virtue and democracy and government are perfectly meaningful concepts, and we're able to think about those things, what would it mean to say that something in our mind or brain resembles them? Resemblance seems out of place with respect to things like truth, virtue, and democracy. But if so, then the mind's ability to represent something, again, does not require any kind of resemblance. Fourth, and finally, Jerry Fodor raises a problem which, not surprisingly, would also help support his own language of thought theory. What makes language such an interesting vehicle of representation is that it generally dispenses with resemblance. The vast majority of words have their meanings without bearing any resemblance whatever to the thing that they're about. Consider the name, Jerry Fodor, which represents the man Jerry Fodor. The words have nothing in common with the man, and yet are about him. Similarly, for just about every word uttered in this paragraph. But if words can represent without resembling the things they represent, then again, resemblance is not necessary for representation. But now similar considerations will apply to the words of mentalese, the language of thought. Indeed, Fodor suggests, thought has certain linguistic features that images just cannot capture. In particular, intentional states are propositional and discrete in nature, while images are overly rich in information. Suppose you think the thought, Fred has short hair. That's a thought about Fred, and specifically and only about his short hair. It's not making any reference to any of Fred's other properties. But now consider how you would create an image, something which represents Fred's having short hair by virtue of resembling Fred's having short hair. Sure, you could draw Fred with short hair, but that image, indeed any image of Fred, would represent many of his aspects besides his hair. How tall he is, how heavy he is, what his eyebrows are like, whether he's sitting or standing, and so on. The question then is this: what image could represent just that one single thought? The thought that we're capable of thinking independently of any other thoughts, the thought that Fred has short hair. The advantage of language is that it can represent without resembling what it represents, and so the language of thought can represent discrete facts like this one, that Fred has short hair, in a way that any mechanism invoking resemblance simply could not do. Putting all these together, then, whatever role mental images may play in our cognitive lives in general, it seems that our ability to have intentional states, to have concepts about things, simply doesn't depend on the resemblance between whatever's inside us and what's out there. We need some other theory. Theory 2, the causal covariance theory. Our next theory takes us up a few centuries, from the 18th century early modern period to 21st century philosophy of mind. Gone largely is the idea that what we're actually aware of during thought and perception are mental images instead of physical objects, and gone with it the idea that mental images are the primary vehicles of mental representation. Instead, with the rise of functionalist and computational theories of mind, we get the idea, as we've explored at some length, that what does the representing in our minds are symbols, purely syntactic entities defined by their physical properties, much as the squiggles in John Searle's Chinese room thought experiment back in Lecture 6 were said to be meaningful Chinese words. What's crucial about such symbols, and again think about the words in ordinary language, is that they're conceived to be meaningful, to be about things, but not at all by resembling the things that they're about. The word tree doesn't look anything like a tree, for example, and yet it is, of course, about trees. Our question, then, is somewhat refined. Again, we're seeking an account of intentionality, of how things in the mind come to be about things in the world. The things in the mind we're now exploring are symbols. So we're asking how symbols, which needn't resemble whatever they're about, come to be about those things. And that's where the causal covariance theory steps in. The basic idea of causal covariance. The basic idea couldn't be simpler. A particular mental representation, a symbol in one's mind or brain, is about something insofar as it causally covaries with the thing. To illustrate this idea, imagine a certain squiggle in one's brain, a pattern of neural activity, if you like. What makes that squiggle, that symbol, be about cows, we might ask, just for example? Or alternatively, what makes it the case that when that symbol is activated, you're thinking about cows? Answer, roughly, according to this theory, there's some regular causal connection between cows out there and the activation of that symbol in here. If cows in your perceptual field regularly cause that symbol to be activated, if, as the philosophers say, that symbol causally co-varies with cows, then that symbol is about cows. No resemblance between squiggle and cows is necessary as long as the causation is in place. We'll get into the details in a moment, but first a little groundwork. In what follows, we'll be speaking about a mental symbol or representation which we'll call a squiggle. We'll assume that that squiggle is about cows, and thus that the activation of that symbol in our minds amounts to our thinking about cows, and we'll be trying to clarify the conditions under which this squiggle in fact has come to mean cow. A first version of the causal covariance theory. So let's start with our basic idea, stated a little bit more precisely. The squiggle means cow if and only if all and only cows cause the squiggle to be activated. The causal covariation is in place. The squiggle will be regularly caused by cows, but alas, as we're about to see, there's still much room for improvement in this theory. First, something called the breath problem. We want the squiggle to mean cow, i.e., to refer to all cows in general. But we surely can't require that all cows actually have succeeded or will succeed in causing the squiggle to be activated in the agent's head. After all, any individual is unlikely ever to actually perceive even the smallest fraction of all the cows which ever were, are, or will be. Nor do we want to limit the theory to say that the squiggle only refers to the cows the agent has actually perceived, since again, it's supposed to mean cow in general. So this version of the theory fails to explain how someone can have the general concept of cow based on her causal interactions with only a very small subset of cows. This is known as the breath problem because we need the symbol to apply more broadly than to the actual cows the person has perceived. But second, something called the depth problem. Suppose for a moment that the squiggle is indeed caused every single time any cow is present in the agent's perceptual field. Would that be enough to make the squiggle mean cow? Well, the causal chain between the actual cow and the activation of that symbol actually has numerous members. The cow causes light to reflect in various ways. The light causes various activity in the eyeball, in particular the retina. The retinal activity causes a variety of brain activity, which then results in the activation of the squiggle. If the squiggle is regularly caused by actual cows, then it seems it will be at least as regularly caused by all those intermediaries as well. Whenever that light is present, the squiggle will get activated. Whenever the retina is stimulated that way, whenever that brain activity is occurring, and so on. But then if meaning is a matter of causal covariation, we just as well have to say that the squiggle means retinal pattern P is occurring as much as meaning cow. But surely it doesn't refer to retinal patterns or neural activity or physical properties of light. It is cow the agent is thinking of, not those things. But the theory, as we've stated it so far, cannot explain why the squiggle means cow without meaning any or all of those other intervening causal things as well. This is known as the depth problem because we need the symbol to apply to the right depth, so to speak, in the causal chain. Third, we come to the non-existing objects problem. As we noted way back in Lecture 1, the aboutness of our intentional states need not be limited to actually existing things. We're capable of having thoughts about non-existing things as well. But on the causal covariation theory, as we've stated it so far, aboutness is a matter of causal covariation. Yet how can a squiggle in our head be regularly caused by Bigfoot or the Fountain of Youth, to use our earlier examples, when there are no such things? And finally, fourth, the misperception problem. We sometimes misperceive things. A quick glance at a horse at dusk might cause us to think, cow over there. But then those are cases where something other than a cow causes the squiggle to get activated. But then it's not the case, as our theory has stated so far, that only cows cause the symbol. So with these four problems in mind, we need to revise the theory. This will bring us to a second version of the causal covariance theory. Unfortunately, things get very technical as philosophers try to revise the causal covariance theory to meet these problems. So we'll have to satisfy ourselves with but a quick sketch of the attempted remedy. The key revision will be this, that we should express the causal relationship not between, let's say, squiggles and actual cows, but rather in terms of what are called causal laws. To illustrate, consider what it means to say that there is a law of nature governing some phenomenon. Gravity, for example. It's a law of nature that objects with masses will attract each other. To say that it's a law is to say something more than that, so far every time we've looked, objects have attracted each other in this way. To say there's a law is to say this. Any two objects, wherever they might be, whatever their circumstances, must and will attract each other. It's to say, even where there might not at this moment be two objects, that if there were objects here, they would attract each other. There can be a law governing objects, in other words, even when there are no objects around. So how might we express the causal covariance theory in terms of laws? Rather than relating squiggles and cows, we might say this. The squiggle means cow if and only if there's a causal law of the form cows cause squiggles. And to say that is to say, as we've just been describing, something like this. If there were a cow present, it would cause the squiggle to be activated. And that, of course, can be true even in cases where no cows are actually present. Now, many philosophers think that this revised version of the causal covariance theory can handle at least some of the earlier problems we looked at. For we can now say that the squiggle applies to all cows, even those the person will never perceive, because such cows would activate the squiggle were they to be present to the person, which handles the breadth problem. Similarly, the non-existing objects problem is solved. It can be true that a given squiggle would be activated were Bigfoot to be around, and so it can mean Bigfoot even if the man-beast himself doesn't exist. And arguably, the revised theory can handle the depth problem as well, but since there's less consensus on that one, we won't go through the details here. But finally then, what about the misperception problem? Well, it turns out things get pretty hairy here, Bigfoot-style hairy. In fact, the misperception problem has been the focus of much philosophical attention over the past couple of decades, so let's have a closer look. The problem of misperception and the language of thought. The problem again is this. The causal covariance theory is basically the idea that a symbol refers to or means whatever regularly causes it to be activated. But sometimes we misperceive things. A horse at dusk might cause us to think, cow there. But then it would seem that our squiggle, which regularly covaries with cows, might covary even more reliably with something else, something we might refer to as a cow or horse at dusk. For anything which is either a cow or a horse at dusk activates it. But then the causal covariance theory seems to dictate that the squiggle means not cow, but instead cow or horse at dusk. In which case, we haven't actually misperceived at all, for what we saw here was indeed a cow or horse at dusk. But of course, that's not what we want to say. We want to say that a horse at dusk might sometimes mistakenly cause us to think cow. We want our squiggle to mean just cow, even when things other than cows can cause it. But the causal covariance theory makes the symbol mean whatever causes it, including things other than cows, and so that's just where the causal covariance theory goes wrong. Now, one of the most vigorous attempts to solve the misperception problem comes from none other than Jerry Fodor. For his own language of thought theory, it turns out, has much at stake in the causal covariance theory, so it's not a surprise that he takes this problem very seriously. To complete the language of thought theory, recall, he needed to provide some sort of preferably physicalist account of how the syntactic components of thoughts, the symbols of mentalese, come to have their meanings. A theory in which they acquire their meanings through causal laws relating their activations with objects in the world would give Fodor pretty much everything he desired. So let's have a look at what Fodor has to say. Fodor's asymmetric dependence theory. In 1990, Fodor published a pair of essays called A Theory of Content, Parts 1 and 2. In these, he not only developed a detailed causal covariance theory of intentional content, but then responded to no fewer than 11 different objections to the theory. These included the problem of misperception that we've just been discussing. We won't go through the rich details of Fodor's complete theory, but our discussion wouldn't be complete unless we at least sketched the main idea behind his treatment of misperception. Fodor observes that what's needed is some way to distinguish cases where cows correctly cause squiggles and horses at dusk mistakenly cause them. If we can break the apparent symmetry between such cases, we could restrict the squiggle's meaning to the correct cases and thus keep it meaning cow, while excluding the incorrect cases and thus preclude it from meaning cow or horse at dusk. What we must note, Fodor thus suggests, is the actually asymmetric way in which the mistakenly activated squiggles depend on the correctly activated squiggles. Very simply, a squiggle wouldn't activate on seeing a horse at dusk unless it were already the case that the squiggle means cow. To misperceive a horse as a cow just is to have a symbol activated which is typically caused by cows. But the reverse is not the case. Having that squiggle activate on seeing a cow does not depend on the fact that sometimes horses at dusk can cause that squiggle. Or to put it a little differently, if it weren't true that cows cause those squiggles, then that particular horse at dusk wouldn't cause a squiggle and so be misperceived as a cow. It's precisely because in that context that the horse resembles a cow that it causes the squiggle. But any particular cow would still cause a squiggle even if it weren't true that dusky horses sometimes cause the squiggle. Or to put it differently yet again, dusky horses wouldn't cause squiggles if cows didn't cause squiggles, but cows would still cause squiggles even if dusky horses didn't. Thus, Fodor concludes, horse-caused squiggles depend on cow-caused squiggles, but not vice versa. Thus, the cow-caused squiggles have a kind of priority over the horse-caused squiggles in determining the symbol's meaning. And so we can say the squiggle means cow, not cow or horse at dusk, even if those darn horses sometimes activate the squiggle. Does this theory work? Well, as we noted, it sure generates lots of objections, and Fodor goes on to offer sophisticated responses to each. Suffice to say that although the theory has won few converts, it's surely impressive, and if it works, it would be the nice physicalist theory that so many are looking for to explain intentionality. In any case, before spending further time trying to reach a verdict here, it turns out we actually have some bigger fish to fry. A shocking new way of thinking about intentionality. The issues raised just by the problem of misperception are themselves sufficient reflection that the problem of intentionality is a difficult one. It's no surprise, then, that there's nothing approaching consensus amongst philosophers on any particular theory of intentionality, not on the resemblance theory, nor the causal covariance theory, nor other theories we haven't discussed, for the problem is just too hard to allow any straightforward solution. And surely the bombshell that Harvard philosopher Hilary Putnam dropped into the discussion in 1975 didn't help much. For in that year, Putnam published what is perhaps the single most discussed article in the past 35 years, a long essay called The Meaning of Meaning. There's a reason this piece has caused such a hubbub. It's because at its core is a fascinating thought experiment, one where science fiction meets philosophy. And it's because this thought experiment suggests the quite shocking conclusion that, put bluntly, I'm going to do that paragraph again. For in that year, Putnam published what is perhaps the single most discussed article in the past 35 years, a long essay called The Meaning of Meaning. There's a reason this piece has caused such a hubbub. It's because at its core is a fascinating thought experiment, one where science fiction meets philosophy. And it's also because this thought experiment suggests the quite shocking conclusion that, put bluntly, our intentional states are not actually in our heads. But before having a look, we need a little bit of background. Internalism versus externalism in the philosophy of mind. Although Descartes' dualism is no longer very popular, it remains intuitively hard to give up its basic idea that our thoughts are in some sense insulated from the external world. They may not be insulated causally, assuming mind-body causation, but rather logically, as the philosophers would put it. What thought we're thinking at a given moment, the content of our intentional state, seems to be entirely a function of what's inside us, even if our thoughts might often be caused by external things. One way to probe this intuition is to imagine that someone were to build a molecule-by-molecule duplicate of your brain, one with exactly the same properties, processes, and states as your actual brain. Such a brain, it seems intuitively, would have exactly the same mental states as yours. If you are right now thinking that maybe you should leave work a little early today, then that molecular duplicate brain would be thinking precisely the same thought. Or so it seems intuitively to most people. To agree with this intuition that brain duplicates would also be mental state duplicates is to think of mental states as being in the head. Just which mental state one is in depends only on what's inside the head at a given moment. The doctrine that this is so is known as internalism. But now some science fiction. Now, molecular duplicate brains are already science fiction, of course, and Tufts philosopher Daniel Dennett, whom we met in Lecture 8's discussion of the intentional stance theory, begins chipping away at internalism by further probing our intuitions about such cases. Dennett first describes some of his own intentional states about his wife Susan. He then imagines a molecular duplicate of himself and asks whether that duplicate Dan has precisely the same mental states as original Dan. Perhaps not, Dennett suggests, for original Dan has thoughts about Susan, but duplicate Dan, despite his resemblance to original Dan, has never actually met Susan. Similarly, original Dan might be enjoying some memories of childhood friends, and duplicate Dan might be in eerily similar mental states, but cannot be said to be remembering those very same people, for again, he has never actually met them. In fact, we might even imagine that duplicate Dan was just formed a few minutes ago from a pile of molecules on the table. Although his brain states might be identical to those of original Dan at that moment, he can't be truly said to know any of the people Dan knows, for he just came into existence. So we cannot say he's in exactly the same mental states as original Dan after all. If so, the precise thoughts an individual is having could not be read off from his brain, as it were, for brain duplicates need not, after all, be mental state duplicates. The doctrine that this is so is called externalism. And now some more science fiction. But now comes Hilary Putnam's famous thought experiment, which takes this idea and goes with it. Imagine a molecular duplicate not just of some individual person, but of Earth as a whole. For every individual thing on Earth, there's a molecular duplicate on Twin Earth. And yes, that means that you yourself will have a molecular twin on Twin Earth, doing precisely whatever you are doing at every particular moment, including listening to a version of this lecture. There's only one difference between Earth and Twin Earth. On Earth, the stuff that we call water is made of H2O, as we've all learned, but on Twin Earth, the stuff they call water, which is visually and even chemically indistinguishable from H2O, is in fact not H2O, but something else. Let's just say XYZ. No one can tell the difference. What they call water looks exactly the same as what we call water and functions exactly analogously in their bodies and so on. Now suppose you're feeling thirsty. You think to yourself, I sure would like some water. At the same time, Twin You is thinking something she expresses with the words, I sure would like some water. Now, are you and Twin You thinking the same thought at this moment? Are you expressing the same desire? Do you have, in other words, identical intentional states? One thing is granted, your bodies and brains are molecular duplicates. You may ignore the H2O that's present in our bodies. And you can appreciate at least the inclination to say that you and Twin You do have the same intentional states. After all, your brains are in the same state, and you're expressing your thought and desire with the very same sentence. And yet, a strong case can be made for the opposing position. For intentional states, as we've seen, are defined by their aboutness, by what they're about. Thoughts about different things count as different thoughts. And your thought is about H2O, while your twin's thought is about XYZ. Yes, you might both use the word water to express that thought, but water for you refers to H2O, while water for Twin You refers to XYZ. And of course, H2O and XYZ are not the same things, even if they happen to be indistinguishable. So you and Twin You are not thinking about the same things after all, in which case you are not having the same thoughts. And yet you're physical duplicates and brain duplicates. If so, then intentional states here do not depend on merely what's in the head. There's some unavoidable external factor that at least partly determines just what our intentional states are about, and thus just which intentional states we're in. And so, to use Putnam's famous expression, intentional states are not simply in the head after all. The aftershocks. Such an assertion rocked the world of philosophy, as you can imagine. The Twinner thought experiment turns out to be a kind of lens through which you may explore your intuitions about a whole host of interrelated ideas, including not merely the nature of mental states, but also of linguistic meaning, scientific categories, causation, and so on. But for our purposes, the implications for the philosophy of mind are dramatic enough. If Putnam's externalism is correct, if what mental state you're in is partly a function of what's external to your brain, then, first, we can no longer treat mental properties as simply depending on what's going on in the brain, and second, we might have to reject the idea that we have a kind of privileged access to our own mental states. After all, given the indistinguishability of H2O and XYZ, not even the two twins would realize that their thoughts were about different things, and so they wouldn't count as experts about their own mental states. And third, the problem of mental causation will get even thornier, as we'll explore further in Lecture 13. For if the intentional content of one's mental state is determined by factors outside the brain altogether, it's hard to see how intentional content can be causally relevant. The key question, though, is whether externalism is correct, and the debate continues there as we speak. In this lecture, our discussion of intentionality reached its peak. We explored two different theories about how entities in the brain or mind might come to be about things, the resemblance theory and the causal covariance theory. We discovered that what our intentional states are about might in the end depend on factors outside our brains, which will surely complicate our attempt to understand the relationship between mind and brain. And overall, we can now appreciate just how difficult the problem of intentionality is, and that there's no clear solution to it in sight. In the next two lectures, we'll shift gears and turn our focus now to the other main domain of the mental, the nature of qualia.
This ends Lecture 10.